In this lecture, we will discuss how a nerve impulse is transmitted. The plasma membrane of a resting or inactive neuron is polarized, which means that there are fewer positive ions sitting on the inner face of the neuron's plasma membrane than there are on its outer face. The major positive ions inside the cell are potassium, and the major positive ions outside the cell are sodium. As long as the inside remains more negative than the outside, the neurons will stay inactive. Now, when a neuron is stimulated adequately, the gates of sodium channels in the membrane open. And because sodium is in much higher concentration outside the cell, it will then diffuse quickly into the neuron. This inward rush of sodium ions changes the polarity of the neuron's membrane at that site, an event called depolarization. If the stimuli is strong enough and the sodium influx is great enough, the local depolarization activates the neuron to initiate and transmit a long-distance signal called an action potential, also called a nerve impulse in neurons. In Figure A, it shows the resting membrane electrical condition, where sodium is on the outside and potassium is on the inside. In B, it shows what happens when a stimulus causes depolarization and the sodium starts rushing into the cell. The nerve impulse is an all or none response. It's like firing a gun. It is either propagated over the entire axon or it doesn't happen at all. The nerve impulse never goes part way along an axon's length, nor does it die out halfway through. In C, we see the depolarization and the generation of an action potential down the length of the axon. And in D, it shows the action potential propagating rapidly along the entire length of the membrane. So after the sodium rushes in, the potassium ions will rush out of the cell into the tissue fluid, and they do so very rapidly. This outflow of positive ions from the cell restores the electrical conditions at the membrane to the polarized or setting state. This event is called repolarization. Until this happens, the neuron cannot conduct another impulse. Now, after the repolarization, the sodium-potassium pump will use ATP, the energy molecule, to pump excess sodium ions out of the cell and bring potassium ions back into the cell. So in E, we can see the repolarization where potassium is diffusing out of the cell, restoring that negative charge on the inside of the membrane. And in F, we see the sodium-potassium pump restoring the sodiums to the outside and bringing the potassiums back to the inside of the cell. So far, we've explained only the irritability aspect of neuronal functioning. So now let's talk about conductivity. So when that action potential reaches an axon terminal, the tiny vesicles containing the neurotransmitter chemical fuse with the axonal membrane, causing pore-like openings to form and release the neurotransmitter. The molecules diffuse across the synapse and bind to receptors on the membrane of the next neuron. If enough neurotransmitter is released, then the process we just explained starts in this new neuron with a whole new action potential. Wow, pretty cool, huh? So here we see how neurons communicate at chemical synapses. And here, and here, and here. And you can see what's happening. We're starting that next action potential, all right, as it continues on. Although there are many types of communication between neurons, most of what the body must do every day is programmed as reflexes. They are much like one-way streets. Once a reflex begins, it goes in the same direction. Always. Reflexes occur over neural pathways called reflex arcs and involve both the CNS and the PNS structures. Here we can see the 5 basic elements of reflex arc. Stimulus is first involved. The information goes down a sensory neuron. Then it goes to an integration center to be processed. This information goes up to the brain and back to determine what to do with the incoming stimuli. After it has been processed, the information of what to do goes out a motor neuron. Then off to the effector, which in this case is a muscle, but it could be a gland if we need to release a hormone. And figure B shows a simple patellar or knee jerk reflex. So information comes in from a sensory neuron. In this case, there is no interneuron to intercept the information. So it goes straight out through a synapse in the gray matter off to the motor neuron. Now the motor neuron tells the muscle what to do. This involves a simple 2-neuron reflex. A 3-neuron reflex arc is shown in C here. Information comes in from a sensory receptors. It travels through the sensory neuron, then on to the interneuron, which decides what to do with the information, then down a motor neuron to the muscle, in this example, to move the hand away from the tack. Wow, pretty cool, huh? Somatic reflexes include all reflexes that stimulate skeletal muscles. Autonomic reflexes regulate the activity of smooth muscles, the heart, the glands, secretion of saliva, and changes in the size of the eye pupils are just 2 such reflexes. Autonomic reflexes also regulate such body functions as digestion and elimination and blood pressure and sweating. All of those. And this is a photo of a physician testing the patella or the knee jerk reflex. I'm sure most of you have probably had that done before. Now, what are the key points of this lecture? Let's describe the events of an action potential, and how is a stimulus transmitted across the synapse, and what is a reflex? Well, that takes care of lecture number 3. Let's move on to lecture number 4.